Have you ever wondered what happens when the protective instinct of a father collides with the cold hunger of a relentless predator? In a forgotten corner of the savannah, a silent terror scene unfolds when a monstrous python attacks a defenseless calf, his deadly hug squeezing the life of the young creature. The herd watches, paralyzed by fear, and all hope seems lost. But they underestimated an even more powerful force of nature, a father's fury. Get ready to witness the breathtaking moment when a colossal bull, seeing her offspring in mortal danger, releases a load of fury so unbelievable that she will make her heart trigger. This is not just a struggle for survival. It is an epic explosion of primal courage that will change life in Savana forever. You will not want to lose a single second of this unforgettable battle. The morning sun launched a golden shine over the vast savannah, painting the landscape with amber and gold tones. The high grass, dry through the season, wavered gently with the morning breeze, creating a sea of movement that extended to where the view reached. It was a scenario of apparent tranquility, a stage where wildlife unfolded in its immemorial rhythm, with predators and prey playing their ancestral roles. In this world of raw beauty and constant danger, a trim of cattle was peacefully grazed, its robust bodies moving slowly between the tufts of grass. Among them, a young calf, with their innocence stamped on their large dark eyes, walked a little away from the flock, attracted by the promise of a greener sprout, without realizing the shadow that's silently silent by low vegetation. Life, in its most pure and vulnerable form, was about to collide with death in its most relentless and cold manifestation. The python, a creature of primordial power and infinite patience, moved with a fluidity that denied its colossal size. Their scales, a brown and yellow mosaic, camouflaged it perfectly against the dry soil and the dead foliage. Each muscle of his winding body worked in perfect harmony, driving it forward with terrifying stealth. The target was already chosen, the little calf, whose curiosity had taken him away from the vigilant protection of the herd. The serpent was in no hurry. Time was his ally, and the surprise his more lethal weapon. Her eyes, dark slits without emotion, settled in the prey with a hypnotic intensity, calculating the distance, the angle, the exact moment of the attack. The air seemed to be denser, loaded with the tension of a predator at the apex of his hunt, a force of nature about to trigger a disappointment that still enjoyed the sweetness of the morning. The calf, absorbed in his small exploitation, continued to nibble the vegetation, his tail swinging with contentment. He was the embodiment of youth and vitality, a symbol of the promise of continuity of the herd. His mother, a brown-coat cow and watchful, grazed, occasionally lifting her head to check the offspring, trusting the apparent peace of the savannah. Little did she know that hidden a few meters, a lethal threat observed her son's movement. The python, as a reptilian spectrum, awaited the perfect moment, a moment of distraction, a second fraction in which the vigilance of the herd diminished. The calm that reigned was a fragile illusion, a thin layer of normality about to abyss own imminent danger. The predator and prey were now in an inevitable collision course, a silent drama about to explode in a struggle desperate for survival. The attack was an explosion of speed and strength. In a blink of an eye, the python projected out of its hiding place, a blur of scales and muscle that cut the air with deadly accuracy. Their sharp prey stared at the soft neck of the calf, an anchor point for what would come next. The small animal let out an acute bar in pain and surprise, his young, fragile body shaken by the sudden impact. Before he could even sue what was happening, the serpent's body began to curl around him, a non-warm, constricting hug, only the promise of a slow and suffocating death. The deadly bond was squeezed every second, crushing the life of the calf, whose panic was reflected in his wide eyes. The savannah, once a place of peace, had become a horror arena. The sound of the desperate barrel of the calf cut the air like a knife, an acute alarm that broke the monotony of the grazing. The heads of the flock rose in unison, the eyes of each animal facing the terrible scene that unfolded. Panic began to spread between them, a murmur of anxious mutes and the sound of hooves hitting the floor. The mother of the calf, in particular, has entered a state of frantic despair, her maternal instinct shouting to run to the aid of her offspring, but the paralyzing fear of the predator kept her at a hesitant distance. She saw her son fighting, the small body writhing uselessly at the relentless tightening of the giant snake. Impotence was a torture, a heavy burden that crushed his heart as his offspring was gone before his eyes. The python, indifferent to the herd's panic, continued its macabre work. Each time the calf exhaled, the snake squeezed its ring a little more, a refined technique over millennia of evolution to crush the ribs and prevent the next inspiration. The body of the calf, once full of energy and life, was beginning to be flabby, its movements becoming weaker and more sporadic. The fight was almost at the end for the young victim. The predator, with his cold and calculating eyes, already anticipated the meal that would support him for weeks. For the serpent, it was just another cycle of hunting and food, the brutal law of nature in its raw form. For the calf, it was the end of a short and promising short life, a destination sealed by chance and hunger for a silent hunter. Savannah witnessed the tragedy silently. The scene was a picture of despair and resignation. The flock observed, a silent choir of witnesses of the brutality of wildlife. Some animals began to move away, guided by the instinct of self-preservation, while others remained, mesmerized by horror. The calf's mother was still there, her tremendous body, a guttural sound of anguish escaping from her throat. She was the image of maternal pain, such a deep and visceral pain that it seemed to tear her own soul. The sun continued to climb into the sky, indifferent to the drama that unfolded below, its golden lights now illuminating an imminent death scene. The small body of the calf was almost motionless, the last breath of life about to be extinguished by the snake's overwhelming hug. It was then, at the moment of greater despair, that something changed. A tremor traveled the floor, a low, deep sound that began to grow in intensity. It was not the sound of panic, but something much older and powerful, the fury. Far, at the end of the flock, a massive figure began to move. It was the bull, the herd patriarch, a colossus of muscle and bone whose role was to protect his flock at all costs. His eyes, once calm, now burned with a red light of anger. He had seen the attack, heard the screams of help, and now the herd's inertia was about to be broken by an unimaginable force of fury. The earth began to shake under its heavy hooves. The bull raised his head, a mighty might echoing through the savannah. A guttural challenge launched against the predator who had dared to attack one of his own. The sound was not of fear, but of a promise of violent retribution. He began to advance, first slowly, then gaining speed, his massive body turning into a living lace. The dust climbed under its hooves, creating a cloud that announced its approach. The serpent, focused on his prey, did not seem to notice the imminent threat until it was too late. The fate of the sealed calf was now suspended in the balance, while a titanic force of protective fury rushed to change the course of events in a way that no one could predict. The battle for the little calf's life was about to take a dramatic and violent course. The bull, a dark-haired giant and imposing horns that bowed as sharp daggers, was the embodiment of contained power. Normally, his presence was a soothing force for the herd, a silent guardian whose mere detailed existence most predators. He spent his days grazing with a royal calm, watching his flock with eyes that contained the wisdom of countless stations. But the scene that unfolded before him aroused something primary inside, a sleeping fury that now boiled like a volcano about to erupt. The terrorized barrel of the calf and the vision of the contorted body of one of his in the clutches of a predator was the spark that lit the fire of his protective wrath. The tranquility of his countenance disappeared, replaced by a mask of concentrated fury. His muscles were tensioned under thick skin, and a deep, noisy breathing escaped his nostrils, turning into clouds of steam in the still, fresh morning air. The patriarch was awake, and hell was about to follow him. He didn't hesitate. The decision to attack was instantaneous, a reflection forged by the instinct to protect its lineage. Lowering his massive head, he pointed his deadly horns directly to the tangle of serpent and calf. Its load was not a blind panic act, but a calculated attack, driven by pure and focused anger. Each step was deliberate, covering the terrain at a surprising speed for a creature of its size. The floor shaved under the impact of its hooves, a war drum that announced imminent revenge. The python, still absorbed in subjugating his prey, finally realized the approaching threat. The calf, though traumatized, would be close to his mother, learning a harsh lesson about the dangers of the world beyond the safety of the herd. The image of the fury bull would be engraved in his memory, a symbol of power and protection. The sun was now high in the sky, its heat starting to intensify. The herd, united again, began to move slowly, moving away from the battle scene. The body of the python was left behind, a silent testimony of the drama that had unfolded, soon to be complained by the savannah necrophages. Life would continue as it always does. But for that herd, the day would be remembered as the day when her silent leader woke up, releasing an unimaginable fury to save one of her. The silent load of the bull would become a whispered legend in the breeze of the savannah, a story of courage and ferocity. The bull took its usual position on the periphery of the herd, his eyes sweeping the horizon, always vigilant. Fury had passed, but the determination remained. He was the guardian, the protector, the indomitable heart of his flock. His act of bravery was not just a rescue, it was a statement. A statement that as long as he lived, no one would mess with his family impunity. The savannah had witnessed the awakening of a formidable force, and the memory of that day would serve as a lasting warning to all who lived under the vast African sky. The order had been restored, not by peace, but by an act of overwhelming violence in the name of love and protection. The savannah, in its vast and indifferent majesty, absorbed the morning violence as the dry land absorbs the rain. The dust raised by the furious load of the bull was slowly based, returning clarity to the air. The silence that followed the battle was deep, broken only by the buzz of insects and the so-called distant from a bird. Nature does not judge, she simply witnesses. The twisted acacias, with their flat hearts, rose as silent sentinels, their leaves shawl smoothly, having observed numerous dramas like this along their long lives. They saw the unfolding of the hunt, the panic of the flock, and the explosive fury of the bull. His rough trunks and thorny branches would keep the memory of that moment, a silent secret recorded in his own existence. The scenario of the confrontation, now peaceful, kept the marks of the fight. the trampled grass, the bloodstains darkening in the soil, and the broken body of the python. The serpent's corpse, once a predator at the top of his jail, was now just carrion, a feast waiting. It was not long before the first opportunists arrived. Vultures, circulating loudly in the sky like black points against bright blue, began to descend in slow and graceful spirals. His sharp views had detected the promise of an easy meal. They landed at a respectful distance, their naked necks and penetrating eyes evaluating the scene with cautious patience. They were the Savannian gravediggers, playing a vital role in the cycle of life and death, cleaning the landscape of the drama of the day. Their arrival was a sign that the tragedy of one being had become the opportunity of another, the brutal economy of nature in full functioning. Other necrophages, such as hyenas and chacals, would be attracted to the smell of blood, completing the recycling process. Meanwhile, the herd of cattle continued her way, placing distance between them and the place of violence. The rhythm of the herd was slower, more cohesive. There was a new sobriety in their movements. The rescued calf walked glued to his mother's flank, who poked him kindly with the muzzle every few steps, a gesture of reaffirmation and comfort. The marks on his neck were a visible reminder of his almost death experience, but the shock in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a trembling exhaustion. He had learned a lesson that no other calf of his age knew. The world was a place of teeth and claws, and security was a fragile illusion that depended on the strength and courage of others. The trauma of the meeting would change him forever, instilling in him a caution that would serve him well in the future. The bull, hero of the day, walked with a tired dignity. The adrenaline of the battle had diminished, leaving behind muscle pain and deep fatigue. But its status inside the herd had been indelibly cemented. He was no longer just the leader. He was the savior, the champion. The other animals in the flock kept a respectful distance, throwing him look of admiration and reverence. His fury had been terrifying, but had been a just fury, born of the protective instinct. He had reaffirmed the social order of the herd, demonstrating that leadership was not just about size and strength, but about the desire to use this power to defend the vulnerable. His legacy would not be written in words, but in the continuous survival of his lineage, a living testimony of his bravery. The sun hit its zenith, throwing short and hard shadows on the landscape. The heat was intense, making the air shake over the plain. Life in the savannah has re-established, seeking refuge of the warmth of noon. The predators who hunted at dawn now resting on burrows or under the shadow of rocky trees and outcrops. The memory of the morning confrontation would remain, however. Other animals that witnessed the event from afar, a herd of zebras, a family of gnus, would take the image of the fury of the bull. It would be a warning tale, a reminder of the unexpected power that could be found even in the most common prey. The dynamics of power in the region had subtly changed, the reputation of that cattle herd reinforced by the ferocity of its leader. As the afternoon advanced, the vultures finally descended on the python corpse. There was a frenzy of nipples tearing and wings by beating, an ugly but necessary turmoil. They worked quickly, stripping the serpent's skeleton with brutal efficiency. At dusk, there would be little more than bones, to tell the story of the great serpent that underestimated the fury of a protective bull. The cycle of nature continued, indifferent to heroes and villains, only to the flow of energy from one creature to another. Each piece of the python would be returned to the ecosystem, feeding other lives and nourishing the soil from which the grass would grow to feed cattle once again. It was a perfect and relentless circle. In the distance, the herd found a well of water and gathered to drink. Fresh water relieved its thirst and washed the dust of the day. There was a sense of community and relief as they drank side by side. The calf drank deeply, the water calming his nerves in shakes. He remained close to his mother, finding security in his heat and presence. The bull drank last, his eyes still sweeping the surroundings, his vigilance never decreasing. He was the perpetual guardian, the weight of responsibility resting on his wide shoulders. The tranquility of the water well was a counterpoint welcome to the morning's violence, a moment of peace achieved with a lot of effort. The sun began to dive into the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange, pink, and purple. The beauty of the African sunset was breathtaking, a spectacular ending for a dramatic day. The herd's silhouette against the colorful sky was an image of resilience and resistance. They had faced death and survived. They had witnessed the fury and the courage and came out stronger and more united. The savannah, with its vast open spaces and its wild beauty, was a stage for stories of life and death, of fear and bravery. And that day, she had witnessed a story that would echo for a long time. The echoes of that meeting would reverberate not only in the memories of the herd, but also in the landscape itself. The python bones, whitening by the sun, would remain as a silent monument. The trampled grass would eventually grow again. The story would be told not in words, but in the cautious behavior of a young calf, the unquestionable authority of a powerful bull, and the strengthened cohesion of a herd that faced the abyss and was rescued by an unlikely hero. The savannah would keep its silent testimony, the echoes of fury and survival blowing neath the winds through the plains opened by many coming stations. The sun rose relentlessly, turning the savannah into a furnace. The once fresh and promising air had become heavy and oppressive, loaded with the heat that radiated from the dry earth. For the python, the heat was a two-edged knife. He made her slower, but also made her prey more lethargic and less vigilant. She had spent hours, maybe days, waiting patiently on her hiding place, her cold blood slowly adapting to room temperature, keeping energy for the crucial moment. His will was singular, focused on one goal, the primordial need to feed. This will was an old force, improved by millions of years of evolution, a silent and relentless compulsion that boosted it to hunt. The calf, in his innocence, represented the satisfaction of this need, a source of support that would guarantee his survival for many weeks. The initial battle was not only of physical strength, but a collision of the calf's will to live against the serpent's will to kill. When the python attacked, it was the culmination of this focused will. Each movement was needed, efficient, the result of an improved instinct. The constricting hug was not an act of anger or malice, but the methodical application of a deadly technique. The serpent felt the frantic heartbeat of her prey. She felt the air being expelled from her lungs and responded by squeezing more strongly. It was a macabre dance, a fight of wills waged in silence. The calf's will was desperate, an instinctive and chaotic struggle to break free, to breathe, to live. He struggled and writhing, but his young strength was no match for the crushing power and refined technique of the predator. Under the Brazilian sun, the serpent's will was prevailing, the life of the calf being slowly extinguished by the inexorable power of the hunter. Nature seemed to have chosen its winner in this primordial dispute. However, a stronger will was about to enter the arena. The will of the bull was not only about individual survival, but about the preservation of his flock, his lineage, his legacy. It was a forged will in responsibility and protective instinct. Seeing the calf in danger, his will, once asleep, erupted with the strength of a storm. It was not hunger that propelled him, but a much more complex and powerful instinct: love, in its most primal and fierce form. Its load was not just a physical attack, it was the physical manifestation of his indomitable will to protect his own. He was willing to risk his own life, to face a dangerous predator, not for himself, but by one of his family's most vulnerable members. This altruistic will was a force that the python, in its lonely and instinctive existence, could not understand or equate. The collision between the bull and the python was therefore more than a simple physical confrontation. It was a battle of wills. On the one hand, the serpent's cold and calculating will to kill to survive. On the other, the ardent and furious will of the bull to protect to ensure the future. The scorching sun seemed to intensify the drama, its heat reflecting the intensity of emotions at stake. The force of the bull, amplified by his protective fury, was overwhelming. He was not just fighting a physical enemy, he was fighting his own death that threatened to bring one of his descendants. Each blow of its horns, every footstep of its hooves, was a statement of its superior will. The python, whose only motivation was hunger, had no answer to such ferocity. His will to fight evaporated before such an overwhelming and determined force. The victory of the Taurus was a victory of the collective will on the individual. He represented the strength of the community, the power of the social bond, and the responsibility that comes with the leadership. His fury was not only yours, it was the fury of the calf's mother, the fear of the flock, the need for survival of the group, all channeled into a single and devastating act of violence. The serpent, a lonely creature, struggled only by itself. In contrast, the bull struggled for something bigger. This fundamental difference in purpose was what ultimately decided the result of the battle. The desire to protect proved infinitely stronger than the desire to consume. Savannah has witnessed a fundamental truth. An individual's strength may be great, but the strength of a community, united by a common purpose, can be invincible. After the battle, the bull was panting under the relentless sun, the physical cost of his evident victory in his exhaustion. But his will did not hesitate. He remained vigilant, ensuring that the threat was completely eliminated before allowing any rest. This perseverance, even after victory, was another testimony of his iron will. He was not satisfied in just saving the calf. He was determined to ensure that such a threat would not get back to haunt his flock. The annihilation of the serpent was the logical conclusion of his protective will, an end act to restore security and order. The heat of the day did not decrease its determination. On the contrary, it seemed to forge its resolution in steel. The calf, in turn, experienced the fragility of his own will in the face of overwhelming power, but also witnessed the savior power of the will of another. This experience would mark him deeply. He learned that survival does not always depend on the strength itself, but on the strength of the group and the will of its protectors. His will to live, almost extinct, was rekindled by the intervention of the bull. He stood up, trembling but alive, a symbol of resilience that is possible when a strong will struggles in the name of another. The sun, which almost shared his death, now illuminated his return to life, his way back to the safety of the flock. As the day turned into the afternoon, the intensity of the battle of wills gave way to a tired peace. The herd, gathered and secure, moved as a single entity, its cohesion reinforced by the drama they had shared. The will of the bull to protect had triumphed, and the result was the survival and unity of his flock. He guided them away from the conflict site towards safer pastures and cooler waters, his silent leadership now imbued with a new layer of respect and authority. The battle under the scorching sun had tested the boundaries of all involved, revealing the strength of their wills. In the end, the story that unfolded in Savannah that day was not just about a predator and a prey. It was a story about different types of will by colliding under a relentless sun. The instinctive will of the calf and the protective and indomitable will of the bull. It was the will of the bull, born of love and responsibility, that emerged victorious, proving that, even in the wild and brutal world, the forces of the community and protection can overcome the lone hunger of the predator. Savannah would remain a place of testing, but that day, a leader of protecting his own had recorded a new legend in the old landscape. The sun paints the savanna of melancholy orange and purple, but the beauty of the twilight could not completely erase the shadows left by the morning meeting. Although the physical threat of the python had been eliminated by the fury of the bull, the scars of the event were deep and varied, marking not only the skin, but also the psyche of the herd. The most visible scar belonged, of course, to the young calf. The marks of the prey on his neck and the bruises on his body were painful reminders of his encounter with death. But the deepest wounds were not visible to the naked eye. The trauma had stolen part of his youthful innocence, replacing it with a state of warding perpetual and a fear of the world that he once explored with careless curiosity. Each rustle in the grass, every shadow in motion, now caused a panic start, an echo of the serpent's hug of the serpent. The mother of the calf also carried her own scars. The anguish of witnessing his son in the claws of a predator, the paralyzing impotence he felt, left an indelible mark in his heart. His surveillance, already keen by the maternal instinct, has become almost feverish. She rarely let the calf move away more than a few steps, her gaze constantly sweeping the surroundings in search of danger. The sound of her mewkid became lower, more anxious, and she was easily frightened. The relief of having his son back was intertwined with the persistent fear that security was a passing illusion. The joy of her motherhood was now dyed with the dark ink of anxiety, an emotional scar she would carry for the rest of her days, a constant reminder of the fragility of life she had brought into the world. The bull, the hero of history, was not unharmed. Although he had no physical injuries to battle, the burden of his fury and the responsibility he carried left his own marks. The explosion of violence, although necessary, had charged its price. There was a new severity in his behavior, a loneliness in his eyes that did not exist before. He had touched in a primal and violent part of his nature, and the memory of that fury remained with him. The weight of leadership seemed heavier, the constant need for more demanding surveillance. He had become more isolated from the rest of the herd, a figure of power and respect, but also of an inherent loneliness. The scar he carried was that of knowledge, the knowledge of the brutality needed to protect those he loved, and the burden of being the only one capable of wielding such power. The herd as a whole has also been transformed by experience. The dynamics of the group has changed. Confidence in the security of your number has been shaken, replaced by a collective consciousness of ever-present danger. They grouped more, their most synchronized movements as if they sought safety in their physical proximity. There were fewer jokes among young people, less carefree pasture. A veil of sobriety had fallen over the flock. They had witnessed death closely and the fury of their leader, and both events left them changed. The hierarchy was reinforced, the authority of the unquestionable bull, but the group's cohesion was now born of both shared fear and kinship. They were a family marked by a tragedy, united by the scars of a terrible day. The landscape itself seemed to keep the memory of battle. The place where the python was killed became a place avoided by the herd. Even after the necrophages cleared the remains, an aura of death seemed to hover over the place. The trampled grass and blood-stained soil would recover, but for the animals that witnessed the event, that piece of land would forever be a place of bad omen. It would be a scar in the landscape, a geographical reminder of the confrontation. The memory of the place would be transmitted through generations, not in words, but in instinct, a place to be passed with caution and a close look on the shoulder. Over time, the physical wounds of the calf healed, leaving only pale marks on his skin. It would grow, and the intensity of its trauma could decrease, but would never completely disappear. He would become a more cautious and perhaps less confident adult than his peers. His experience, however, would make him more in tune with danger, a skill that could one day save himself or others. The scar, although born of pain, could turn into a form of strength, a wisdom acquired the most difficult way. He would carry the story of his survival in his own body and behavior, a living testimony of the day when death claimed him and fury freed him. The emotional scars of mother and bull would also become part of who they were. The mother's anxiety would manifest himself as a fierce protection, making her one of the most vigilant caregivers in the herd. The loneliness of the bull would solidify his position as a distant but effective leader, whose reputation alone could stop future attacks. The scars, although painful, shaped their roles within the community, strengthening the social structure of the herd in subtle but significant ways. The pain of the past was transformed into survival strategies for the future, the mark of life resilience in the face of adversity. As the night fell and the stars began to shine in the vast African sky, the herd settled to rest. They lay together, their hot bodies offering comfort and a sense of security. The silence was deep, but the hearts of the herd were not totally at peace. The scars of the day pulsed into their collective memories. They were survivors, but survival always has a cost. The encounter with the python and the fury of the bull have left indelible marks, weaving a new layer of complexity in the tapestry of their lives. They were a marked herd, a testimony of the fact that, in nature, no experience, especially such a violent, passes without a lasting trail. Visible and invisible scars have become part of their shared history, a dark reminder of the fine line between life and death in the savannah. They had been tested, and though injured, had settled. The marks they carried were the price of their survival and a symbol of the force they found in each other to face the terrors of their wild world. When the twilight poured its soft colors over the savannah, the story of the day began to turn into something else. It was no longer just a traumatic event and began to become a legend, a tale of courage that would be whispered in the bristle of the night and transmitted not by words, but by actions and instincts. The bull legacy was not only that of a savior, but that of a lighthouse of courage. Its bold action has established a new pattern of bravery inside the herd. The younger bulls, who had witnessed their furious burden, looked at him with a new reverence. They saw firsthand what meant being a leader and protective, and this lesson would be more powerful than any demonstration of physical mastery. The bull's legacy would be the inspiration he planted in the hearts of the next generation of guardians. The calf, the involuntary catalyst of all the drama, would carry the most personal legacy of that day. Each time he looked at the scars on his body, he would remember not only the terror, but also the ransom. He would remember the strength that arose in his defense when his own failed. This memory of courage would mold it. Instead of being defined only by his fear, he would also be defined by gratitude and knowledge that courage exists even in the darker moments. When he became an adult, perhaps he himself became a protector, his almost death experience giving him a unique understanding of danger and the need to intervene. His legacy would be living proof that one can inspire strength in another. The story would spread beyond the limits of the herd. Other animals that gathered nearby, who saw the commotion from afar, would take the news. A herd of gnus would tell about the bull that challenged a giant python. A family of zebras would remember the floor shaking under the bull's load. These stories, though simple, would serve as a warning to predators in the area. The reputation of that cattle herd would change. They would no longer be seen as easy prey. They would be known as the flock with the leader who had an unimaginable fury. The bull's legacy of courage became an invisible shield, an aura of respect and fear that would protect the herd a long time after the memory of the specific event began to disappear. Inside the herd, the story would be told and retold in nonverbal ways. It would be told in the way the calf's mother protected him fiercely, a behavior that other mothers could imitate. It would be told in the strongest cohesion of the flock, in its tendency to move as a more unified unit. It would be told in the vigilant silence of the bull himself, whose mere presence was a constant reminder of what he was capable. Legacy was not a tale of glory, but a practical survival lesson woven in the herd's own social structure. Courage had become part of his collective identity, an inheritance transmitted through behavior and instinct. Over the seasons, the bull would aging. His strength would decrease, and one day, a younger and stronger bull would challenge him and take his place as a leader. But the legacy of his courage would remain. The new leader, having grown in the shadow of the Taurus legend, would know the standard expected of him. The history of the python and calf would become a founding tale for the herd, a myth that defined its values: protection, courage, and the strength of the community. The act of a single bull in a single day would ensure the safety and resilience of its lineage for coming generations. This was the lasting power of his legacy. The calf, now a strong young bull, would carry physical scars as a map of his history. They would be a sign for others that he was a survivor. He could never achieve the legendary status of his savior, but would live his life with a wisdom that others did not have. He would understand the fine line between life and death and the power of courageous intervention. He would teach his own children to be cautious but not fearful, to respect the danger but never underestimate the power of courage. The legacy he carried was more subtle but equally important, the legacy of resilience and wisdom born of trauma. At dusk, when the herd gathered near a well of water, the scene was peaceful, but under calm, the story lived. She was in the bull's vigilant eyes, the mother's protective touch, the youth's scars, and the cohesion of the flock. The story was a reminder that life in Savannah was not only a struggle for survival, but also a screen for acts of unexpected heroism. The bull legacy was not just about killing a snake. It was about stating that even in a world governed by brutal instincts, qualities such as courage, sacrifice, and love could emerge as the most powerful forces of all. And so, the story would be told at twilight, not with words, but with the silent presence of a herd that was forever changed by an act of courage. It would be told in respect that other animals gave them, in the security they enjoyed. The bull, in his act of protective fury, not only saved a life, he forged a legend. He left a legacy of courage that became as part of the savannah as acacias and infinite sky, an eternal story of how even in the heart of wild nature, bravery can create a light that drives away the darker shadows. Time would transform the event into myth. The future generations of the herd could not know the exact details, but they would feel the truth of the story in their bones. They would inherit instinctive caution about creeping predators and innate respect for their leaders. The act of courage of the bull would become part of its cultural DNA, a guiding force that would shape its destiny. And on quiet nights, when the wind blown through the plains, the story could almost be heard. The story of how a bull, moved by unbelievable fury, faced death to defend an innocent, leaving behind a legacy of courage that would never die.